Hello, I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro.
Welcome to Shake and Not Burn. Every day we're bombarded with headlines of crisis and disruption, from climate shocks to inequality to AI upheaval.
But behind the noise are choices, patterns, and opportunities. What we need is sustainability literacy, the clarity and confidence to interpret complexity, see trade-offs, and make decisions.
Our podcast goes beyond the headlines to uncover how real people are tackling change and what we can learn from them.
You can use these ideas to stay steady, even unshakable, in a world that feels uncertain.
This is Shaken Not Burned.
Hello and welcome to a new episode of Shaken Not Burned. I am your co-host, Giulia Bottaro. 2025 was a year. So many depressing events have happened or are continuing. I don't even know where to start. There are ongoing genocides in countries like Palestine and Sudan. Trump became president in the US and started to dismantle the green agenda, not only domestically but globally. The European Union, generally regarded as one of the most progressive jurisdictions for sustainability, is taking massive steps back and watering down crucial legislation. Far-right governments are becoming more popular and more extreme. The Earth reached its first tipping point, with warm water coral reefs unlikely to recover unless we drastically reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The billionaire dystopia continued as Jeff Bezos hijacked Venice for his wedding weekend, and Elon Musk is in line to become the world's first trillionaire. The list could go on, and these are the issues that upset me personally the most, but I'm sure everybody has their own. All of this begs the question, are we fucked? Now, I'm 30 and I've been somewhat aware of what's going on in the world for probably 15 years. History teaches us that everything happens in a cycle, so I'm very patiently waiting for things to get better. To start off the year on what could be a positive note, we're having two special guests who have been in sustainability for decades and hopefully can provide us with some insight on why we must continue fighting the good fight. If you've listened to Shake and Not Burn before, you'll recognize our first guest, who is my brilliant co-host, co-founder, and mentor, Felicia Jackson. And our second guest is Mike Scott, writer, journalist, and director at Carbon Copy Communications. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
It is a pleasure, yeah.
So before we start, why don't you tell me a little bit about your careers and, how long you've been in sustainability and you've got a lot of experience, so the highlights. Mike, why don't you start?
So I've been a journalist for more than 30 years, starting on local newspapers and then ended up at the Financial Times. And while I was there, I got interested in sustainability and started writing about it for the paper. It was so long ago that I wrote a series on what we were calling then non-financial issues, which is what we know as ESG today. And then I went freelance in 2006. And shortly after, I got involved with an outfit called New Energy Finance, where I met Felicia for the first time. Given my FT background, it was sort of from a follow the money perspective. So who was investing in this? What were the risks to companies? What were the impacts companies were having on the environment? That kind of thing. And I've been doing that ever since.
Wow.
Can I just say what I love about that is the fact that you've actually been able to watch the evolution from when it was non-financial issues and then it became that question of what's the danger to my business of all this climate and sustainability stuff. And now we actually genuinely are talking about, hang on a minute, what's the impact of my business on the world around me and society and the climate? Watching that evolution and actually having been someone watching it, it's kind of exciting, kind of depressing, but kind of exciting.
How about you, Fee? How about your experience?
I have a slightly different route because I was actually in digital before I got involved in sustainability and climate. I suppose I've got a real interest in disruption and technology. That's actually how I got into this whole world. Mike mentioned that we met at New Energy Finance and I actually started working there. I remember being really worried because I didn't know if I'd be interested in energy. But You'd
Yeah.
suddenly discover all of these things are interconnected. And, you start looking at energy, and we were looking at who's investing in what and where and why and how. And then you're going, well, hang on a minute. If they're investing in renewable energy, carbon really matters. And that's when I wrote a book about the carbon markets. And then I realized that I didn't understand how policy was made. So I went back to university, did a degree in global energy and climate policy, and actually ended up staying at the university and teaching there for 10 years. But so I've worked as a journalist, as an entrepreneur, as an academic. And I just think we are at a point which feels very depressing. But it also could be seen as the death throes of a system that's no longer fit for purpose. So the status quo is fighting back against all the advances we've actually managed to make. And we just have to keep pushing forward.
Okay, that's a really good start. I'm already encouraged a little bit. So looking back at 2025, how would you rate this year on a scale from 1 to 10 in terms of what's been achieved in the sustainability space?
At a headline level, I would say about a 2. But underneath that, I think there are some signs of encouragement, and I would say 6, maybe 7. All of the
Like that.
the obvious things are terrible. You mentioned Trump and his dismantling of environmental rules in the US and the knock-on effects that's had on legislation in Europe. But if you look around the world, you would see that people are more and more interested in this and more realizing that this is central to their survival as nations and economies. We tend to focus on that Anglo-European, North American world, but in the Middle East, across Asia, Africa, there's loads and loads of good stuff going on. Also, at a business level, we're just in a place where solar is the cheapest power in the world, and where when there's not enough power in Pakistan, 20% of the population are installing solar panels to get around the lack of power and the high prices. EVs are a juggernaut that is just rolling out faster and faster, obviously in China, but also in Europe and across Asia, and not just in cars as well. Buses will be electric in future. There's not really an argument about that. But trucks as well. I've talked to people in the logistics industry. There's a way to go in terms of putting the infrastructure in place. But 10 years ago, people saying were just impossible are likely to be the technology winner. So I think there's a lot of stuff that is going on in quite a boring, out of sight way. Batteries as well, energy storage is having an amazing transformative effect on the entire system. This is business. Business is quite dull. Trump screaming and shouting makes the headlines.
I love the fact that you started with a 2 and ended up with about a 6, because I came in at a 4. So I'm nicely averaging your
So
viewpoint.
your vote is a 4.
Well, it
2025.
depends what you're talking about. And actually, I think that's a really interesting point you made, Mike, about the infrastructure and the stuff happening behind the scenes. Because the fundamental reality is that I think the way we're hearing the story is coloured a lot by the media and by the politicisation of these different issues. The economics are really quite basic, and they're not going to change. Volatility and uncertainty, increasing extreme weather, and fundamental changes in precipitation patterns, which affect things like crop growth and supply chains and commodity costs. These are fundamental shifts which, whatever we say politically, aren't going to stop happening.
Yeah.
For example, if you go to Asia, everyone is talking about what to do next. It's all about green climate. It's new financial mechanisms. It's putting in place taxonomies. It's putting in place policies. Even in the EU and Europe, you can look at what the central banks are doing. I think the Bank of England has just come out with a new approach to how it expects banks to manage financial risks.
That's right.
These fundamental underpinnings of the economy are going to drive the decisions that businesses have to make.
Yeah.
What you're hearing from companies is that they don't want to talk about it because they don't want to get in trouble. They don't want to be misunderstood. They don't want to be told off for not doing it perfectly by activists or getting caught up in woke by is it rude to call them regressives? Probably. But people who are perhaps anti-climate change or who are arguing that regulation or legislation or reporting is too much of a burden on business. And this is the fundamental problem of time horizons, because most businesses are set up to think about what's going to happen in the next few months.
At a headline level, you've got Saudi blocking progress at COP. But at the same time, Aramco has a target to install 3 gigawatts of solar power. It's either this year or by 2030. The UAE is investing huge amounts of money in renewable energy. These economies all across the Gulf and the oil-producing countries, they are diversifying their economies at pace because they know that that bedrock of income that they've had from oil and gas for the last 50 years is going. They're looking to move into other areas. You have to look at what people are doing as much as what they're saying. And obviously that
Yeah,
works in reverse with Trump. But in the early 2020s, things probably weren't as bright as we thought they were. And I don't think things are as bad as they appear now.
okay,
Actually, this brings me
interesting.
back to, the point about media and communications, which is we get so much of it from the way things are framed for us by the media.
Exactly.
And although there are lots of independent voices, there are still dominant news programs and national papers. And actually, if we don't have a reasonable and calm perspective about what's going on and how we actually meet the challenges we face, that's a problem for society as a whole.
Look at the UK media reporting on electric vehicles. You'd think that it was a calamity and that sales were dropping every month, when in fact they're going up every month. But they somehow managed to find one little wrinkle and present. It's the exact opposite of what's happening. EV sales are
Yeah,
progressing at pace, and that story is being hidden from people, and that matters because people think they're on their own in caring about this, when in fact there are a lot more people who are concerned about this than the media would have you think.
Just wanted to bring up the 89% project, which is a project by a group of publishers to try and talk about climate in a more positive and accessible way, because research showed that 89% of people actually believe there should be action on climate change. The problem is that most of them think they're the only one. There is no conversation about the fact that this is just the future. This is what we need to do. This is how we're going to have to change what we do. And we need to have those conversations about the real things that are happening on the ground, but also the trade-offs that we're just genuinely going to have to make because things are changing.
Another issue about the media, which is kind of funny because it's 3 journalists here bashing the media, but
We know it the best.
is that the focus in countries like the UK and I mean Italy for as long as I've been alive is the cost of living crisis. People are poor, and it's like climate is not as important. People are poor. People
but that
need
affects
to
the cost of
on that.
living.
And exactly. So once we start making that connection of taking climate action will also benefit the cost of living crisis and improve everybody's wallets. And it's the interconnectedness that you were talking about earlier. People are thinking in silos, and that is definitely the fault of the media.
It is that thing of there's research that shows that about 50% of the inflation in basic commodity prices like coffee and chocolate is climate related. It's to do with frosts on the crops at the wrong time, or too much rain, or it's the same amount of rain on the same plot of land, but instead of it raining a little bit for 30 days, it all comes down in one day and the topsoil's washed away. These are things that are really changing what we're doing. And as Mike said, solar is the cheapest form of energy available. The question is how it's presented to us, how it's costed, and where that price goes. Do you remember there was all that talk about cutting all the green crap? Because it was basic. We were all being told that the reason that the cost of electricity was high was because of green taxes. And a huge part of what was keeping the cost of electricity high was the price of gas on the international wholesale market. But it's complicated And so people don't want to talk about it.
Going back to the main conversation, which is about how badly things are, what are your expectations for 2026?
I think more of the same in terms of Trump will still be president. There's been a pushback in European regulations, but the rollouts will continue. It's going to be like mobile phones. One day it's the size of a brick, and then the next thing you know, you look around and everybody's got a smartphone.
And one could take them to the moon.
Well, yes, indeed.
What are you referring to? What is the equivalent of the smartphone
Electric
for
cars
sustainability?
or a grid that is, majority renewables. The majority of homes having some kind of battery storage or being tapped into distributed heat or distributed energy. Energy efficiency measures run automatically through your smart meter. Again, it's the boring infrastructure and mechanics of it is rolling out while there's, certain politicians screaming and shouting about the problems. And there are definitely challenges, with the framing of certain political parties of net zero as being a massive burden on consumers. But the thing they always do is they take the cost of what you're doing to cut carbon and they compare that to doing nothing. So obviously the cost of doing nothing from their point of view is zero, which isn't true because
For now.
if you do nothing, the whole thing crumbles. But also these things they're not simply costs, they're investments. They have a return both to the people who invest in them and to consumers. And they will continue to roll out, though it will be slower than it would otherwise have been because of some of the rollbacks. But it will.
They're just going to make it more difficult.
Yeah, but it will rumble on, and the more renewables that get installed, the more EVs there are on the road, the more the system changes and becomes better suited to those technologies.
Everybody thinks it's impossible until after it's happened. It's always seen as a problem, as an expense, as we'll never be able to make that kind of a change. But if you actually look at the research about innovation and technological change, you get to 3%. Once you get to 3% of a market, that's pretty much when it's going to change. It's going to shift. It's just a question of time.
So you need subsidies for that 3%, for example.
Well, certainly to even the playing field, because one of the concerns about this discussion of cost is that developing and deploying new technologies does take money, but you're comparing the cost of deployed technologies to industries that have got sunk costs going back 70 years, 150 years.
Yeah.
They're not the same thing. We're not making fair comparisons between one and the other. And we're not including, as Mike pointed out, the cost of doing nothing, because the cost of doing nothing is not nothing. It is the cost of all of the implications and consequences of doing nothing. What I'm seeing is really interesting because having lived through the digital transformation and the disruption that caused back in the 90s and businesses that started and businesses that failed and everyone telling you that, this was ridiculous, the internet was never really going to be a thing, why would people want to do things differently? Julia, you laugh. I was seriously sort of almost patted on the head and told to go away when I wanted to launch a digital business.
Okay, so that I mean, suppose that's reassuring for all the people that want to implement sustainability.
But what I was going to say is what we're seeing is all the conversations around that change. So there are conversations about new financial mechanisms. Out of Belém, there were conversations, new mechanisms, there were new agreements. We may not have seen exactly what we wanted to see at COP, but often I think what we want to see at COP from the outside is some magical agreement and solution that we're going to solve the climate challenge. That's not what COP is for. It's to keep people in the same room and talking to each other and trying to reach agreement in a world that it's increasingly fragmented. And I think to that extent, just the fact that it happens is a really positive thing. So,
yeah. COP every year is a disappointment and it is framed as a failure because from a purely logistical point of view, it is an event every year and arguments about where next year's is going to be. But it's not an event. This is the 10th anniversary of the Paris Agreement. You need to look not so much at what happened in Belém as where we are now compared to where we were in 2015, almost
It's
it's a
very different.
completely different landscape.
Okay, before we dive into that, because I have questions about difference between now and 2015, I just wanted to point out that people were extremely disappointed by the fact that there were so many lobbyists for the oil and gas industry and barely an indigenous people. So what's your thought on that?
Can I just say that while that's dreadful in terms of convening all the voices that need to be together, it's actually weirdly a very strong signal that what happens in the COP process is incredibly important to the oil and gas industry. It's the same with the agriculture industry. They're sending lobbyists and representatives because that is where change is going to happen.
Yeah. And they do know this. They are defending their interests as businesses, but they're also trying to get a handle on how they navigate the future, because and to an extent you can't blame them for trying to protect their business. It's what they do. In another sense, you very much can blame them, but they're
I mean, every business wants to survive and thrive.
Exactly.
And
so they're looking for ways around that, and
they won't let themselves see the reality of what's being talked about.
There's a saying that I used to hear a lot at conferences, which was, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem looks like a nail. So they're trying to solve all of these problems with some kind of oil-based fuel, hydrogen, or carbon capture.
Absolutely. The bridge fuel.
Yeah, well,
Don't get me started.
Yeah, transition fuels and all of that.
So what were the difference then between 2015 and now?
Well,
are you
I mean,
happy
in 2015, the price of renewables was still really high, and so these things were almost sci-fi. They were very much aspirational. They were very much future focused. Although it had started, we hadn't really seen the full impact that climate change is having, and I dare say we still haven't, but we're right in it now. This is a today problem, but also these are today solutions. They're cost competitive. We really know how to integrate them, and we're integrating far more renewables than was thought possible at the time of Paris without completely revamping grids. Now that work definitely needs to happen, but for capacity reasons as much as because of the complexities of integrating renewables. I think the difference is that in those 10 years, the pace of change in clean energy and clean technologies has just been enormous.
It's also accelerating.
And it's accelerating.
That's what's fascinating to me.
It's accelerating because of the technological advances, but also, again, the really dull stuff. We know how to finance it now. We know how to insure it. It's all that really basic. That's the learning curve, it's all that really
it's the
basic
contracting.
Stuff. Yeah, we know how to
contracting logistics.
We know how to procure it. It gets more and more boring, and that's a good thing.
Yeah,
boring
like
means embedded.
Yeah, exactly.
Level. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. How we
but
do.
The reason I jumped up and down and got excited was actually one of the things I think has fundamentally shifted in the last 10 years is people's understanding of the impact of insurance. The insurance industry has been worried about climate for a very long time, but in the last 10 years, it's got to the point that it's affecting people. And I'm not just talking about real estate investors having problems getting insurance in floodplains or, a project, but I'm talking about actually affecting people's homes, where they work. And once you start having impacts hitting people, that upsets politicians and it means they pay more attention. So the insurance industry, I think, is going to be a really important driver of change because in the end, it's quiet, it's behind the scenes, but if you can't get insurance, you can't really do anything.
Yeah.
So that combined with financial mechanisms and, in fact, we mentioned the lack of indigenous voices in the climate process, but the very fact that's being recognised and people are attempting to rectify it is a fundamental shift.
Yeah, and coming at it from the other end, one of the main drivers for climate progress in Asia, in India and China is air pollution. They have these partly justified arguments about the West should should pay for this because they caused all the pollution. But from the bottom up, people are saying, we're dying in these polluted cities. Do something about it. And that's something they have to do themselves. And so that, I think, has had a major impact on their willingness and ability to act in a climate-friendly way. But that's sort of coincidence. They're trying to tackle air pollution with great success, because it's really easy to see the impacts, and also to do something about it quite quickly.
You mentioned the fact that people are upset about really polluted cities. People have increasingly more access to all the information in the world, basically, with the phones. Well, we mentioned earlier, people had brick phones. Now we all have the smartphones. Yet at the same time, people are voting for far-right governments. And an alarming amount of young people say in polls that they would rather have a dictatorship because it feels less chaotic. So, how do we reconcile this thing that people can be more informed but end up,
Don't think
having these political views?
I don't think access to information is related to knowledge or understanding. And I think sometimes it can kind of result in the opposite. The thing we do forget a lot of the time in the conversations about what we should do and how we should do it is people are afraid. People are worried about what's going to happen. They're worried about how to pay for their bills. They don't know what's going on. I'm obviously slightly biased, but I do think that a lot of the support for the more right-wing parties is based on misinformation. It's based on blaming, because politicians don't like to talk about the complexity of why things are expensive or pain points that people are going to have to go through to get to a better place. If you have a group of people you can blame, if you have a political ideology you can blame, that gives everyone a focus, and it's easy and it's simple, and people do like simple. It's just basic heuristics.
Does then involve effort on my part, right? If I'm blaming someone else, then I don't need to do anything. I don't need to change my life.
Because it's not your fault. You're not responsible.
Yeah.
You don't have to do anything except be angry.
Yeah.
Yeah, because for me, when you mentioned the air pollution, I thought of this question because I thought people can ask for change. My city is very polluted. I have asthma, do something, right? So in my head, I'm thinking, well, we could technically, collectively all get together and ask for a better world.
There are solutions, really easy ones, because people are coming up with the ideas for how to do this all the time.
There are many, many simple individual solutions. Lump them all together and it gets complicated. There's a UK scientist called Ben Goldacre who used to write a column for The Guardian called Bad Science. He wrote a book putting all of these columns together, and it was called, and this is my motto for the climate, really. It was called, I think you'll find it's a bit more complicated than that. And that's the thing.
That's been my journey of learning.
Yeah, it is complicated, and people don't like complicated. They want simple answers to what they think are simple questions. They're not simple questions, and therefore the answers aren't simple either. To a large extent, society did and does work so well because we have provided the answers to so many complicated questions already, that people totally take them for granted and forget about the centuries, decades of work that have gone into building road networks, building better cars so that you can drive from London to Milan under the sea and then through mountains, and all of this stuff is just there now. But all of it took a lot of hard work by a lot of people and a lot of thinking and planning and
a lot of failure.
And so and a lot of failure. But so all of that fossil fuel infrastructure that is presented as the inevitable present, and all of the stuff that's not there yet is like this pie in the sky sci-fi future. But we're in that process of building it out, of building that infrastructure, and that's the point I was making earlier. We'll turn around, and suddenly everyone will have an EV,
and it will be in place.
Everyone will have a smart meter, And
it was probably the same 100 years
Yeah.
ago. People would think it was crazy that a family had 3 cars.
That was my point about technological change, because things just change while you're not looking.
Yeah. The artist David Hockney was interviewed a few years ago, and he was very famous for being at the cutting edge of technology, using fax machines and then iPads to create art and stuff. And someone asked him about this. Does it change how you are as an artist because you're using all this technology? And he said, the thing you have to remember is that a pencil is technology, because it's just there. Everyone completely takes it for granted. All of these things are technology until they are ubiquitous, and then they're just stuff. And so we're in the building out phase of a lot of this stuff that will be essential to the low carbon future.
One of the things that's really important about that is actually remembering that we can imagine a different future, because the problem we have with this idea of what we have today just being the end result is that nothing is ever static. Everything is always changing. What we need to do is be able to stand here and go, let's imagine a future that we can achieve that looks different from this in ways that are positive and beneficial to us all.
Harking back to the past that the populists have, and also the inability to see how these new technologies can make life better, is fundamentally a lack of imagination. They can't see an alternative future, so they hark back to an imaginary past.
Yeah.
Well, can I add to that the fundamental problem that everyone always talks about, the good old days? When you're living in them, yeah, there were good things, but there were also really awful things, because that's just life. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just always cherry-picked what they want to pick from the past that serves their agenda. I just wanted to say, before I move to the next question, we should have a little add about Shaken Not Burned, because you were saying, Mike, earlier that all these things are very complicated. Both questions and answers are, and our podcast is here for that. It's here to help people demystify everything, and I just had to say it. Anecdotally, it feels that many people are hopeless right now. The world is on fire. There are so many memes. Young people are depressed. Like, people are just so upset. They don't even have the energy to fight anymore. Can you think of a time when there was this same level of hopelessness, and how did things come out of it?
The 70s and 80s were awful. The IMF was called in to run the UK economy. You had the oil crisis. There was inflation and mass unemployment, and everything was terrible.
We had the 3-day week because you couldn't afford to pay everyone for the full week.
Yeah.
That sounds horrific, all of it.
And also a lot of political instability. The Red Brigade, the Baader-Meinhof gang, and the proper full-on terrorism. Things got better through a combination of some sort of painful political reforms and some technological developments. We went into a period of rapid growth and prosperity, and partly coming back to the European-American axis, the rest of the world grew. Europe grew with all of the benefits of the EU, and then you've got the sort of economic miracle in Japan, and then the rest of Asia. It is tough times out there at the moment, but things will change. We will adjust to a new reality. Humankind is endlessly inventive, for good and ill, but we will come up with solutions that nobody has thought about yet. AI will discover something absurd, and then we'll go, that's great.
Well, there's a whole conversation about quantum computing and whether or not that's going to fundamentally transform the way in which not only AI works, but how electricity demand works.
Nuclear fusion.
I'm still holding my breath on that one.
Sure, or
rather, I'm not holding my breath on that one.
But there have been advances in that were described to me by someone at the UK Atomic Energy Authority as, so for 50 years, this has been a physics problem. Now it's an engineering problem, and we're really good at engineering. So
I love that.
And, fusion has always been 5-10 years away, but now genuinely they think we're on a path.
That's really interesting, because they always said the same thing about fuel cells. It's always 5 to 10 years away from commerciality. But what happened with fuel cells was it got really successful in particular niches.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say,
because you can't solve every problem with the same solution.
No, that's it. Technologies flow into the niches that they're good for. Carbon capture and storage, there's an enormous problem with applying that to everything. But for decarbonising what 2 years ago were called hard to abate industries, and are not really being called that anymore, though, because we know what the solutions are.
They're not hard to abate anymore. They're still expensive to
Yes.
abate, but it's
Expensive to
completely
abate.
doable.
Yeah, but and it's a
Okay.
matter of will. These were completely intractable problems 5 years ago. How are we going to decarbonise cement? How are we going to decarbonise shipping and aviation, steel? Well, all of those solutions for all of those are out there to a greater or lesser extent. And shipping, the pathway is so clear that Trump had to wreck it. But he hasn't wrecked it. He's delayed it.
He's made it more expensive.
He's made it more, yes,
Yeah.
exactly. This is vandalism.
My take on when things have been really awful and then got better is actually much more about our lack of awareness of history, because every generation has had something that has been destructive, or the overwhelming fear, or the thing that changed lives. It was the Second World War. It was the potential for nuclear mutual destruction. Whether it's politics, whether it's finance, whether it's wars, human beings do terrible things to each other for terrible reasons that we wish they wouldn't. But human beings also, when they work together, can do incredibly positive and powerful things, and they can change things for the better. When it comes to a technological transformation, when it's really significant, does cause massive disruption. And that means job losses and concerns and all of these things. There will be a way through, maybe not necessarily for everybody in the way that they would like, but there is a way through, and there are benefits to be gained. Where I think it's challenging with climate change is it feels so utterly existential. But I do actually think the feeling of powerlessness is far more to do with the way we're presented with things. Again, it's this culture of
Yeah.
blame. The reason this bad thing has happened is because of these people or that industry or that approach. But actually, we do have the power to make small changes ourselves, and working together, those changes can be big. I did an interview recently where a new piece of technology, it's shower cap, and one individual user saved 50% of her shower water daily by using this little piece of technology. Doesn't sound like very much. It's a couple of 100 litres. Over the year, that's 20,000 litres. Can you imagine if every household in the UK had that? How
Yeah.
much water would that save? And that's the thing. It's complicated. It's energy, it's water, it's carbon, it's nature, it's biodiversity, it's society, it's justice. It's all of these different things. But we actually can find a way through. What we have to do is think positively. And I know it sounds awful, because when you're depressed, the last thing you want to hear is just get out of bed and do something. But actually, the feeling of powerlessness is something we have been told we have. We've been given that sense of powerlessness by the structures in which we live. We need to remember that that's not true. We're not powerless. And it's not even a question of saying, well, okay, the key levers for change you have as a person are where you invest, what you buy, where you choose to work matters, how you choose to eat matters, how you choose to travel matters. And I'm not saying everyone should do anything they don't want to do. I'm just saying recognize the power that you have, and recognize that if you act collectively, those individual actions are scaled up at a massive level and can have a huge impact.
This ties in a bit to what happened at COP, where the oil-producing countries and China, weirdly, fought to keep any mention of fossil fuels out of the agreement. But I think they were quite clever in setting up these mechanisms for sort of coalitions of the willing to act outside of the COP mechanism. So you've got 80-odd countries joining this commitment to phase out fossil fuels, and then a similar thing on deforestation. And what that means is that you've got this kind of Maginot line of the fossil fuel companies and countries fighting to keep the words fossil fuels out of the COP agreement, and then everyone's just going, okay, well, but we're going to stop using them anyway. And they're not going to produce them if they can't sell them.
So that change is happening.
Exactly. A lot of it will happen outside of the COP process, as it always does. The COP is useful, as you said, just for getting people together in a room and having to look the Marshall Islands in the eye and say, well, it's worth your island sinking just so I can make a few more bucks. In a way, the fact that it is still going is the triumph. I remember that was meant to be Paris, was meant to happen in Copenhagen.
So it took another 6 years to get to Paris.
Exactly.
To be honest, after Copenhagen, it was amazing. It only took 6 years.
Yeah.
There was a lot of very upset people.
There is reason to hope
that things can
we might
change
even
really quickly.
get to the sustainable development goals by 2030.
We're in this transitional, disruptive phase, but what you're seeing is a shift in norms, and there's a pushback, and that's hard. It's hard to navigate. But if you stand your ground as an individual, within a community, as a collective, you get to be part of shifting that norm. That's all it is. So it feels hopeless because we've been told it's hopeless, but that doesn't mean it is. But you do have to engage with the process, basically.
Yeah.
You can't be part of something if you just ignore it's happening.
The takeaway is that we mustn't lose hope. We must get together and we must put effort, because a great world, a better world is achievable. And on this note, I would like to mention a quote by Antonio Gramsci, which says, "The old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time for monsters." Hopefully the monsters will go away soon. Thank you both so much for this amazing episode. I really, really appreciate it. I mean, it was really helpful for me, if anything. These are all the questions that I was dying to ask. And to our listeners, thank you also for joining us for our new season of Shaken Not Burned. We have an amazing years of so many amazing episodes, so I hope you will keep following us. We have a newsletter, we are on social media, so just sign up, follow us, and see you next week.